if you can't tell by now, I absolutely love Resident Evil. It's one of my favorite franchises, period. And there's just something about the cheesy horror mixed with the serious tones, where they have to find some sort of balance to cohabulate. Like, I absolutely love the franchise just for that alone. If it wasn't for fighting games, I would probably be doing a lot more on Resident Evil, but fighting games exist, so yes. And I read this article, well, not read the article, I saw a tweet that basically means I'm an expert on everything that the author was talking about. Sarcasm. But basically, from PC Gamer, Capcom wants to release Resident Evil every year and sees remakes as a way of making it happen. Now, the first thing I thought about was, does this mean we're finally going to get an Outbreak remake? Every single time, every video is going to have an Outbreak reference. I swear to God, because that game deserves both a re-release and a remake. It is genuinely amazing what they did back in the day. I think that game is fantastic. Anyways, I'll go into an Outbreak later on. But that actual article headline right there just made me think, damn, Resident Evil is going to suck now. Okay, that might be a bit hyperbolic, but Resident Evil being a yearly release? I mean, wouldn't it just create like franchise fatigue, where basically we'll be just seeing Resident Evil every year? I already get sick of seeing Pokemon every year. I get sick of seeing Assassin's Creed every year. Like, Resident Evil, what makes it special is its story. Games like Call of Duty don't really have a story. They have one, but no one cares about it. There's probably some Call of Duty purists that understand the story left, right, and center. It doesn't necessarily mean that I know the story and care about it. Well, I don't really care about Resident Evil's story. I do want to just shoot zombies sometimes. But no, like, it asks a lot more questions because Call of Duty at least relies on its multiplayer. So its multiplayer is its main selling point rather than the story. Resident Evil has always been a narrative-based game. It does have multiplayer modes, but none that are really that good. Like, there are some fantastic ones like Outbreak, keep saying that one, Mercenaries, or, you know, even Resident Evil 6 to some extent was a fantastic co-op game. Like, Resident Evil 5 is actually a fantastic co-op game. And yes, I would love to see 6, 5, 0, as well as 1 be remade. I wouldn't want them to be yearly because Resident Evil 3 Remake happened. That happened. I think that game is awful, and Resident Evil 3 is fantastic. Resident Evil Nemesis is an amazing game, and its remake is just awful. So it just goes down that thought process of every one of these games are going to be Resident Evil 3 Remake. And that necessarily isn't true, because Resident Evil 2 Remake's fantastic, Resident Evil 4 Remake's fantastic, the Code Veronica game looks amazing. I mean, well, it's judged because we saw one trailer, but the fact of the matter is, it does look more promising than most. There is always one factor that I'm actually worried about when it comes to any remake past Code Veronica. The biggest issue that I have at the current moment with remakes for Resident Evil specifically is design ideas. So let's take the actual idea of Resident Evil 1, for example. That game was built around claustrophobia. Same thing with Resident Evil 0 to some extent. They were designed around not giving the player every bit of information at the start. They were forcing you basically to go to left to right now that I think about it. I don't know how you would transition that into a Resident Evil 2 remake style of gameplay. I again think that the actual landscape is just way too narrow for them to do it. Jill and Chris would be probably overpowered in a case like a Resident Evil 2 remake or Resident Evil 1 remake. That's a lot of remakes. But nevertheless, I think that Jill and Chris will be way too powerful because the corridors would narrow. So you would have to find a new way of making the survival horror aspect survival horror. Not to mention the actual mansion was quite cramped. You would have to essentially make it so that the corridors were much more wider. I don't know, I'm not a designer on Resident Evil. They could probably already have an idea of what they're trying to do with that. The point I'm trying to make here is this idea of translating philosophies over from game to game into remakes every year is going to lead into eventually mismanagement, I guess is the correct word. The risk is essentially you might end up with Resident Evil 1 remake as just basically Resident Evil 2 remake, only with a weird camera angle. Now, there are some actual games that would work fantastic with Resident Evil 2's gameplay schematics, And it isn't actually Outbreak, it is Dead Aim. Dead Aim is a fantastic example of that idea working because it was kind of designed around that idea to begin with. There was also Resident Evil Survivor. Again, that would probably be a fantastic game to remake, given the fact that it was designed around a very similar philosophy of Resident Evil 2 Remake. But again, those two are designed around the idea of, less around the idea of fixed camera angles, more on the idea of first person perspective shooting at things. So it kind of does fit. Not to mention, one of them happened on a ship and we literally had Revelations. Oh lord, please tell me they're not remaking Revelations. But same idea goes around with Resident Evil 0. The biggest problem with Resident Evil 0 is it's going to have to be a cooperative game in some way, shape or form. So if you're remaking it, you're going to have to remake it as a co-op game. Same thing with Resident Evil 5, 6. These games all have completely different ideas from Resident Evil 2. So translating it on a yearly basis, again, seems kind of counterintuitive. Well, not counterintuitive. Bold. It's more bold than anything. And once again, I have to go into the Outbreak rant. This game does deserve a remake. It deserves a re-release. But again, doing it yearly, I just don't believe Capcom could do it. The game originally, you could play as like 4 people. Like, you could play with 4 people at once or something like that. It was something that happened before MMOs were even a thing. I just feel like if you just translated that all the way as a freaking Resident 2 remake version of the game, I just don't think it works. I just don't think that would work. It could, but no, there's something special about that game that I feel would need some time and effort putting into to make it into an actually good game. Not to mention that, what are you actually doing, right? Because we're just talking about making remakes, but we're not actually dealing with some more interesting ideas. For starters, well, it could be fun to sort of see a pre-Outbreak era. It would be nice to see that. There are a lot more interesting concepts you can do with the universe other than let's make a remake of Raccoon City all over again. Like, you could make a pre-era Outbreak that focuses more on psychological horror. Like, I personally think that would be fantastic because we didn't know what the Outbreak was back then. Like, people in Resident Evil 9 clearly know what I'm going into fanfic here, but people in Resident Evil 9 know what an Outbreak was. Go for Resident Evil -1 and freaking make it much more abstract. Also, another thing here, what about things like Dino Crisis? We were getting like yearly releases of Resident Evil. What about things like Dino Crisis? Why not have a new Dino Crisis if we're just gonna push out new versions of Resident Evil? Be more creative than just remaking the remakes again. Like, but doing a yearly release just kind of bottles that. Like, I don't know. Personally, I just think Resident Evil deserves a little bit more respect than just a yearly release. I like Resident Evil enough that I would probably buy every game in its yearly release. Doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to be happy about it. I just think Resident Evil 3 screwed up too hard. This one has actually been a rant. But yeah, no, it's been an absolute pleasure right now. You make sure to like, comment, subscribe, tell a friend, and yeah. Ja, matane. See, you thought I was going to say matane yo? Nah, we're giving you the matane.